Hey guys. I want to thank David and Alex from Cambrial who helped us to organize this event, Olga and the rest of the CoinFund team as well. This is an incredible turnout, which makes me think it's an interesting topic, and that's how it should be. And I look forward to having a discussion about this. And there's a lot of people in the room who represent not only projects that have these kinds of opportunities, but also funds looking into it, and staking companies and other service providers who are doing related services. So to start off, just a little bit about CoinFund. We've been a crypto investment firm since July 2015. We have about 9 people working for us today, kind of looking at consensus crypto economics, all the different financial structures and exposure mechanisms to blockchain projects. As of this year, we have an anchor and platform partnership with the team at Venrock. If you don't know what Venrock is, it's one of the oldest VC firms in the US. We consider ourselves kind of full stack investors, so we'll invest in not just protocols, fat or thin, but also middleware, and also dApps. We think that applications that have hundreds of millions of users are also interesting and poised to capture value in blockchain. And we also look at centralized companies working on what we call key financial infrastructure. So these are companies like issuance platforms, custody, companies that provide banking services to blockchain startups and secondary issuance platforms. And as of this year, we're also active participants in a number of decentralized networks, some of which are also in our portfolios previously. So, generalized mining. First, I want to make kind of like a philosophical point, which is, in the early stages of decentralized networks, we often think about them as companies. We have a bunch of big VC firms going into early exclusive rounds. They're slicing up token supplies like equity. But I think, like, at the end of the day, when these networks come out and grow, they look a lot more, or I should say, they don't look as much like companies. And there's a few people who have been able to kind of articulate this. One of those people is Jacob from Tezos, and he said, in an excellent post entitled "Blockchains Are Not Startups," he says, "Blockchains are better understood as institutional technology, expanding the possibilities of economic coordination of the web." And this idea that, public blockchains are a lot more interesting than permission blockchains is partially because they are globally accessible technologies, and they're really commons. So in order to understand generalized mining and this set of opportunities, I think we do have to make an assumption. And that assumption is that decentralized networks are going to proliferate. There's going to be many of them. And they're going to become ubiquitous public goods or commons. And if you're a big Bitcoin maximalist, this talk is not for you. When we say decentralized networks in 2015, really we had these things, right? We had kind of cryptocurrency networks. We had a couple of asset issuance platforms like Counterparty, NXT, BitShares. And then Ethereum came along and sort of generalized this idea of issuance into Turing-complete smart contracts. But when we think about decentralized networks in 2018, there's actually a lot of variation on this theme. We see resource networks like Filecoin, Storage, Siacoin. We see computation networks. We see LivePeer is doing transcoding of video. We see content networks like Steemit and other decentralized media and decentralized Twitters and social media. We have a number of DeFi, right? The decentralized financial services networks that are providing lending and other and decentralized insurance, for example, and other things, and registries like DNS. And the idea of generalized mining is that these public networks need participants. We usually think of decentralized networks as being good platforms for marketplaces between customers and providers. There's also like a little bit of a lower level there where there's a marketplace between sort of the supply side that makes the network work and the protocol. And so let's just kind of follow this along. So if we started with Bitcoin or proof of work systems, life was pretty simple. We had miners, we had users. Miners would process transactions, they would get rewarded in Bitcoin. Users would put in transactions, pay transaction fees. When you go to proof of stake systems, miners become validators. You have users, and now you have this third participant type called a delegator. And a delegator is interesting because it doesn't have to be a user. It could be an investor. It could be a speculator. When we go into content networks, we have witnesses, which is the Steam version of validators. We have people who are creating content. We have people who are curating content and potentially getting rewards for doing that. And also a whole market of bots that are curating content. So that's interesting. For those of you guys who are familiar with Polkadot, there's these kinds of participants in the system. Fishermen are at least described to be sort of watchers of the network that submit proofs of wrongdoing. In other words, they're providing security for that network. If you look at layer 2, right, you have hubs that route payments, watchers, routers, dispute resolvers. LivePeer is a network that out of the gate has 5 participant types, and actually, as of recently, they also introduced a 6th participant type called an orchestrator. And you can, down the line, imagine other kinds of participant types that maybe are looking through like video quality, compliance, and things like that. And so in general, we now have a world of decentralized networks that is really spread out across their very different domains that range from just processing transactions on kind of layer 1 base layers. You know, you have folks providing liquidity on things like layer 2, registries, content, and so on and so forth. And even crypto economic mechanisms sort of in their own right? If you followed FOMO 3D, this is definitely an opportunity to make some money if you're smart. And so to summarize, you know, decentralized networks, they need hardware to provision them. They need software to secure them. You know, when we think about proof of stake systems, for example. They need stakeholders or token holders to govern them. And as they develop, they have a long list of supply-side services that they need and that will be provided by third parties to a decentralized protocol that will help them with their particular domain. And so that's, in my mind, what I call generalized mining. There's been other names applied to this, like mining 2.0 or supply-side services, network service provision. But I think if we were to try to define it, and again, I think this is an ongoing conversation, but I would define it as any supply-side service provided by a third party to a decentralized network in exchange for some kind of ROI, maybe in the form of alpha, maybe in the form of token inflation, maybe in the form of customers paying. But it's allocated by the network. In this space, I think is very large, and this is something that a lot of people looking at staking networks today, I think, are kind of missing, or maybe they're just not there yet. But this is kind of a third-party economy in the sense that the set of opportunities and the set of providers is very diverse, very large. It's in the cloud. And then the question becomes, if you have such a large space, how do we make sense of it? And how do we categorize it? And this is my kind of early attempt to do that. And what you, I think, want to first think about is how hardware intensive these opportunities are, how software intensive these opportunities are. And if you're, all the way here, you have a lot of proprietary hardware. You're a Bitcoin miner or a proof of work miner, and relatively little proprietary software. Once you start to get into the middle, I think this is where, and this is an oversimplification, but I think this is where a lot of our staking opportunities that we see today lie. They're not as expensive to deploy on hardware as mining data centers, but they are concerned with physical security and resilience to DDoS and things like that. So it's not exactly the cheapest hardware either. And while the teams are typically providing the node software, we often see teams writing proprietary software to get that protection in place, to get that security in place, to get reliability in place as well. When you go all the way over here, on the other side of the spectrum, here you have opportunities that are actually highly software intensive and often proprietary software intensive, but are really cheap to run basically on AWS. And this way of thinking about it kind of makes you realize that if you're here, you're kind of competing on how much capital you have and economies of scale of big data centers. And if you're in staking, then you're kind of competing on your efficiency of being able to go out to staking networks and maybe being able to go out to a lot of them to efficiently provide security and to get there fast. And if you're here, you're competing on your ability to create more or less proprietary software that generates a lot of alpha. And so this is like kind of a generalization in the green side of maybe what we think of as traditional quantitative trading. So today, I think there are different players around blockchain, and certain players are particularly well positioned for particular sides of the spectrum. If you have been running a big data center, you might be looking at kind of repurposing some of your GPU hardware to mine live peer. If you're a staking company, then you're really interested in the space of networks that have staking and what are their returns, and how do I make a decision around which network to go into, and how do I do this fast, securely, and efficiently. And the quant space, which today, like if you look at the kind of funds that are in blockchain, I think quant is quite underserved. Like the traditional Wall Street people haven't really gotten here yet. But this is a natural fit for them, creating proprietary strategies. And I think this is where crypto funds could shine as well. And so this diagram is just meant to point out that I think the space is much larger than staking, and it's really interesting to think about all the other opportunities that might be out there. And the staking space might be that big. I don't know exactly what size it is. But it's also interesting to point out that not all staking opportunities have delegation. And delegation is sort of the business model that drives kind of service providers or staking companies. And then there's a discussion of where do crypto funds fit in. We run a crypto fund, so that's an interesting question for us and our colleagues in the room. And I think crypto funds have really good reasons to actively participate in these kinds of opportunities and networks. One reason is that it's kind of an alternative way to gain network ownership. One way is that you go into a very early round as a seed investor, but it's actually a lot more flexible to be able to say, like, for certain networks, I kind of want to wait until they're in production with a network that works and then go in. And these generalized mining opportunities enable that to happen. It's a different entry point into the life cycle of a decentralized network. Number two, most funds, generally speaking, take kind of a long-only approach. And if you create a portfolio of these opportunities, then you kind of create an alternative set of returns. And that's interesting in down markets, maybe it's interesting in flat markets. And also investors or crypto funds should be long-term aligned with the projects that they invest in. And so they have an opportunity to improve the probability of their portfolio companies' networks' success. I think there are some situations where eventually crypto funds will have to perform some of these functions. If you're holding a bunch of tokens and those tokens are meant to be used for a very domain-specific purpose and earn a return, and you're not doing that, it might be your fiduciary duty to do that. And if it's not your fiduciary duty to do that, it might just be a competitive pressure to do that. If your competitor is earning these returns and you're not, you might get a call from your investors. In other cases, and I think layer 2 is currently an interesting example of this, is that it is the appropriate way to get exposure to a particular layer of the technology. So, if you look at the space of layer 2 networks, it's probably about 16 projects or so, maybe more, but only just a few of them have token models. Many of them are open source, and there's not a lot of equity opportunities. A lot of the founders are building applications on top, and those applications might have equity opportunities, but they're going to come later, and they're also going to depend on the layer 2 network underneath and the success of it, and there's many networks competing for that role. And other opportunities, investors might just have to put up mining value, and I'm thinking of purely mined cryptocurrencies and things like that, to get access to the network, not something that you can necessarily buy. And I also think that crypto funds are well positioned for generalized mining versus other players, and this is a discussion. I want to hear your feedback on this. But one reason is early access to tokens and kind of pre-knowledge of crypto economics versus your typical trader on the street, who's generally concerned about price and is generally not speaking directly to teams. I think crypto funds have the ability to go into, for example, staking models that don't have the property of delegation. If you are a staking company and your business model depends on third parties delegating to you and you taking a return on that, then you have the biggest affinity to staking networks with delegation models. But some networks don't have that. And so you go into the realm where you might be able, or you might need to kind of create a paper process to create that exposure. And then you get into custody and regulatory issues, and it becomes pretty challenging. And another point, which our colleagues at Multicoin made some really good points in their recent post around loss leading for long-term success. And this goes back to being long-term aligned with your portfolio companies versus someone who's just a classical miner who needs to liquidate the asset in order to remain operational. And then just some examples. Staking on a network that doesn't feature on protocol delegations, we just discussed. Running a hub on a layer 2 network to get direct exposure to the throughput of layer 2 and take a commission fee on that. As an investor, that also increases the liquidity. If you know about layer 2, then how much you capitalize a hub also is equal to the throughput of your layer 2 network. And so by doing that, you're actually making the network better. You're making the network be able to process more transactions. I think a proprietary machine learning algorithm that curates content on a social network or TCR is an interesting example that not many folks have tried, but would add a lot of value to, for example, cleaning up a platform like Steemit. Running a live peer transcoder below market in order to build network effects for the long term. Again, thanks to Multicoin for that thought, or loss leading. taking a CDP and market risk in order to meet demand in DAI markets. And I think there's a lot more stuff to think about here. One thing to think about is what is the set of generalized opportunities that's here, and what is the set that's coming to market? Crypto economics modeling is sort of key to being able to understand how much return an opportunity will get you. It's a very interesting thought, like what is the relationship between borrowing rates and staking returns? If you're an individual and let's say you're not a fund and you didn't have an early stake in that network, well, you might be able to go and borrow some of the assets in order to stake them. And then that creates an interesting relationship between the return rate from staking and the borrowing rate. And then, of course, who are the right people to have on your team as an investor, as a staking company, or as a project doing this that helps bring these sort of opportunities to market? Some examples of funds that have been doing this. There are many, many more. A lot of them are in this room as well. And so I guess in conclusion, decentralized networks might take over the world. I think crypto funds are going to have to get a lot more technological in thinking about these things, really understanding the crypto economics of these systems and being more technical in-house in order to take advantage of these opportunities. And I think pure VCs are going to get more and more constrained into a model where they're in a single stage of the life cycle of a decentralized network. And so if you're holding tokens, and those tokens belong to a staking network, consider staking them today and participating in your networks. Thank you. Do we have time for like a question or two?
No, we don't.
Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you for interesting talk and nice point of view on this. But my question is about that the downside of the story is that decentralization is really hard. And to get all these technologies running, you have to have really decentralized networks. So a lot of nodes running, a lot of users, and a lot of business cases on them. And in general, to bootstrap such a network, it is more expensive than to do a centralized business type solution. So what do you think will be the major economical drives that will allow people to face higher expenses on the initial stage, not only for crypto funds, but also for users and businesses who will use this decentralized network as clients?
I'll be like in this area only.
Okay. Thank you for your question. That's a very interesting question. I think that decentralized networks kind of go through a life cycle, as I mentioned, and I think kind of different phases of that life cycle require different kinds of participants, right? So very often early in the life cycle, you have kind of early stage investors who are bootstrapping the team, who are getting that network into production. Later, you might have miners or stakers or people who are governing the protocol. And then still later, you might have more decentralization as there's a wider distribution sort of the token. And I think we're still like learning what that process looks like, but I think it's pretty clear most people agree that this is a process that sort of takes time, and decentralization kind of happens over time. I would want to dig into the assertion that's more or less expensive than doing a centralized solution. I don't think like that's the correct kind of either or. I think decentralized networks exist because they kind of want to, and the economics of those networks make them possible. I think we do see that. Thank you. One more question. Yes. You, sir.
Why would you make your hands dirty yourself instead of investing in service providers? Then you can spread your risk and you don't need to have the technical expertise yourself.
Probably two main reasons. One reason is that you get more direct exposure. And also, like in the case of layer 2, you can't always get exposure unless you're directly exposed. would be probably the main reason. And again, I think a secondary reason would be that service providers have to kind of come to the market one step at a time, and they're today pretty constrained in what they can do. And I think, like I was saying, I think funds are better positioned for certain opportunities today than service providers. Thank you very much.